Hi, this is Dan Winter again, fractalfield.com, therify.net. Thank you for all the invitations to share and all the interest worldwide. We have probably 20,000 now in our Facebook and also the same in YouTube, and we appreciate all the interest. And therify.net, our plasma tech, is in over 25 countries, and things are going well for us. The advanced research, carbon nano, and many other things are cooking, and there's lots of excitement. Today's conversation is a bit esoteric. It's entitled The Physics and Science of Transcendence, the Rapture, what it means to go into 5D, and the difference between sphere and hypersphere, and understanding grid dynamics a little bit in terms of portals and plasma projection. And this conversation will be in the context of extraterrestrial politics. Now, I know some people think conversing about extraterrestrial politics is too controversial, but I firmly believe that within 1 to 2 years from now, when the treaty allows all the ETs to announce their presence, that all those who have not discussed extraterrestrial politics will begin to feel embarrassed. But first, let's start with something simple. So Teresa Burns, very kindly co-leading our wonderful Facebook discussion group on Ophanim Enochian, politely today asked, Dear Dan Winter, if it may take a moment of your time, would you mind talking to us a little bit here about spheres versus hyperspheres? The way you approach them is a bit different from the approach of many people. You also prefer other shapes to spheres. Could you take a moment and explain why that is? In bioenergetics particularly, you seem to steer people away from spheres. Why? That's a good, very simple, it's a question like, how do you get to the next dimension? Well, you emerge from a sphere. Well, let's start that conversation in terms of something we've talked about many times before, in terms of the study of cancer, actually. Let's see if I can find this. Yes, okay. So here is our little conversation about cancer. That we know, for example, that medical doctors, let me bring my face up here again so you can see me, that medical doctors know the difference between a cancer cell and a cell that's not cancer. One of the primary indicators is when it's cancer, the cell will be more spherical. If the cell is much less spherical, lots of bumpy egg-shaped plasma projective, then it's not cancer. And the simplistic but correct one way to look at that is simple. Cancer is the energy stuck inside the membrane, and a membrane which is spherical is the opposite of plasma projective. It's containment versus distribution. Now, containment is not always evil, but obviously cancer is the opposite of charge distribution efficiency. In other words, the cancer cell has gone asocial. It's gathered all its charge inside, and it's not distributing well. The physics of that is the membrane is too hard, and it doesn't respond to touch. And that contact inhibition, the ability to inhibit replication based on whether it is touched, is the definition of cancer. And it's very metaphoric and useful to see about how when people are touched, if they respond to touch, they're less likely to get cancer. Well, that's true of their cells too. Now, that conversation goes back to structural stability and morphogenesis and laws of form, wherein it was revealed that if you summate parentheses, the inside versus outside of parentheses, you can create the entire calculus. So whether it's inside versus outside is basically a summation of membrane theory, and membrane theory is a summation of how many sine waves are phase locked coherently on one standing wave soap bubble surface, which is why you can define the membrane health of your cell by doing a spectrum analysis, because it determines what music is holding the cell membrane together as a musical soap bubble. That's structural stability and morphogenesis and laws of form in one sentence. So, how does that lead us to this idea of sphere versus hypersphere? Because you see, where I want to go with this is understanding the science. And I do mean wave science by what we mean by, well, are you 5D yet? And have you gone to the next dimension? And have you transcended or ascended yet? And supposing you're an electrical engineer and you wish to discuss those things and actually understand instead of being woo-woo, then this becomes very applicable and grounded and actually something you can use in practice. So what is meant in that case by going to the next dimension or going from a sphere to a hypersphere is the ability to rotate into the next axis of superposed symmetry of rotating charge, something we've said many times before. But let's try to say that another way. Ultimately in physics, there is no such thing as a sphere or a hypersphere. The only thing that there is in physics is waves made of charge. There's nothing else, which is another way of saying there's only an electric field. Physics is nothing except electric fields. And the extent to which an electric field is spherical is the extent to which its inertia is isolated. Its charge is not distributed, and hence cancer. This doesn't mean that spheres are evil, but it means that nature uses spheres only for certain very limited applications, like your eyeball, for example. But other than that, your cells will generally not be spherical because they want to be charge distributive and not charge isolated. So, now let's try to make a more sort of a chemical analysis of this. Let's suppose that we're talking about, let's see, I need to bring my face back here, click on FaceTime again, here we go, okay. And we're talking about going to the next dimension in terms of chemistry. So here's your chemistry teacher talking, and we wanted to give a practical example here. So your chemistry teacher said, the whole atomic table is made of electron shells, and nucleus, protons and electrons, obviously. And your chemistry teacher says, all the major shells of the electrons that make up the whole atomic table are comprised of the same interdigitated nested layerings of the same subshells in the same sequence. They're called S, P, D, and F subshells. Now, your chemistry teacher drills into you by rote, the S suborbital has 2 electrons, and the pi suborbital has 6 electrons, the D and F 10, 14, and that's what you need to remember. But your chemistry teacher never, ever told you the shape. And unfortunately, if he told you the shape, then you could have visualized it. You could become psychokinetic and you could have enacted something in your lucid dreaming. But no, he didn't tell you the shape. Well, here's the shape. This is from Occult Chemistry, Ledbeater-Besant on the left here of the S suborbital, which is basically a teardrop. But now on the right, here's the latest from subatomic quantum physics, what an S suborbital looks like. It's a donut with two teardrops on either side. So if your chemistry teacher would have said, instead of S suborbital, if he'd have said the donut orbital, you'd have actually learned something, and you would have been able to visualize what he's talking about. And the reason that the S suborbital has 2 electrons, obviously, is because there's 2 vortexes present in a donut. It ain't complicated. And similarly, the pi suborbital, a 6th vortex, is actually tetracubic. So here is the original psi perception of quarks, Ledbeater-Besant occult chemistry picture right here. And here on the right is the latest in modern physics view of the pi suborbital. Guess what? Simple tetracube. So if your chemistry teacher had said the cubic orbital or tetracubic orbital instead of the pi suborbital, you'd have actually had a handle on what's happening to those waves called electrons. Now, this is where we get toward our lesson here in going to the next dimension. So now we move up to the next suborbital, the D and F suborbitals. The D suborbital here is pictured here. Basically, it's radiating spokes or teardrops radiating out in dodeca and then F suborbital ecosa symmetry. Obviously, we're leading to how dodeca and ecosa nest in each other infinitely, as D and F suborbitals do nest one inside the other in a stack or an array or Chinese dolls nested fractally to make the layering that completes itself with, for example, the gold and the platinum group metals, which are implosive and phase conjugate and negentropic. So that's where we're going with this. So, point being here for our conversation, the relationship between that pi suborbital, that tetracube, and that D and F suborbital, the D and F suborbital 10, 14 electrons, 5, 7 vortex pair. What are their 5-7 vortex pair in? Well, obviously, if you look at the symmetry axes possible in the dodecahedron, of course, the dodecahedron has 10 faces. Would that be 5 vortex? Well, actually, it has 12 faces, but axes of symmetry, vortex pairs. So the number of vortex pairs possible are 5 and 7, which is 10 and 14 electrons. More specifically, I give you the example of Armand Weiler's advanced work on the 7 axes of spin in the icosahedron. He called it 5 real axes and 2 pseudo axes of rotation. Basically, number of axes of spin of charge superposed. That's what going to the next dimension is. And so when you embed, as you did, that tetracube, which in here, I don't know if you can see it in here. Let me see if we get it in this picture. I'm playing with the camera here. You can almost see the green cube in the very center of that. Well, the angle at which that green cube is embedded in the white balls of that inner dodecahedron, that tilt angle of that cube in that dodecahedron is 32 degrees, the classic chin angle of the Sphinx story. That's how you went to the next dimension. That's how the cube becomes a hypercube, and that's how the sphere becomes a hypersphere. It literally, by nesting it in a higher order of spin, you tilted the cube up 30 degrees, spin it, blink 5 times, and you have pentadodeca. You went to the next dimension. Well, what that meant was there is a longer wave of charge whose axis of charge rotation superposed in that spin enables that embeddability. It's more than Playboy, embeddability. It's the ability to embed a longer wave, that perfect nesting, perfect embedding. And obviously the ratio of that wave edge of that cube to that dodecahedron is 0.618, golden ratio. Hence, you got to conjugate, you got to implode, you got centripetal. The tetracube, infinite stellation of tetracube, has no center. It's the opposite of fractal because it's opposite of compressible, contrary to what Nassim says. And because the adding and multiplying the square root of 2 ratios of tetracube symmetry called the octave is the opposite of compressibility and therefore the opposite of fractal. So you didn't get to the fractality and therefore the conjugation and therefore the implosion and therefore the neg entropy until you rotated into that golden ratio based dodeca, that next dimension, that hypersphere, which enabled charge distribution. So that was an example of how to take that to go into the next dimension. Now we want to use this conversation to introduce something we've talked about many times. Let me see if I can get this in our little PowerPoint here. So this conversation wants to lead into how we plasma project biphase conjugation into longitudinal waves for the same physics, that when that golden ratio series of cascades, which is enabled by the dodeca hypersphere, dodeca ecosa, geometry of Earth grid DNA, zodiac, and Gold's valence electrons, and alchemy, and implosion, and neg entropy, all the important stuff based on golden ratio and fractality and conjugation, which creates the implosive neg entropy, precisely the Planck threshold, and that's my equation. So the slide we've been using to teach about that, if I may, here in this window, the longitudinal keynote, as we presented recently in the Amsterdam Energy Conference. Here it is. Okay. Talked about this many times. Just a short review. So we're about to try to use what we just said, what we just talked about, to explain the physics of not just going to the next dimension, but what really is ascension, and what really is transcendence, and what really is the rapture. Like, if you read the Left Behind from the Religious Fundamentals, they're quite sure that during the rapture, guns will melt. Now, I'm here to explain to you the electrical engineering of why this is correct, among other things. And I'm here to explain to you why the extraterrestrials are so concerned about what's happening with respect to quote-unquote 5D and the pressures on the Earth right now having to do with the moon. And to introduce that, we need to review this slide in front of us right here. So this is from the longitudinal keynote we've used in all the latest lectures. If you look at almost all of my most recent lectures in our famous, if I may say, YouTube channel, fractalfield.com YouTube channel, this is the key slide. So basically what's happening is, as these waves, when they get into this golden ratio embeddability and these vortexes get to the correct angle, which happens to be 60 degrees here, the angle of the cone of embedding a dodecahedron, that the wave that travels down that cone, that vortex, that pine cone, as a golden spiral on that cone, the side view is a caduceus, as you see here, all based on golden ratio, and the vorticity is translated, translation of vorticity perfected, defines golden ratio in hydrodynamic physics. And what is translated specifically is the up and down inertia, which is called the transverse wave of electromagnetics, which is the only way we use electromagnetic fields for everything that communications and military does on this planet, because they don't basically know what a longitudinal wave is, even though it was Tom Bearden's life and the basis of all negentropy and Prairie and Therapy. So longitudinal waves are important, even though conventional physics would have you ignore them, and even though the military would say it's a top secret military weapon to even talk about them, except it's how your mind and your spirit works, so maybe it's important. So anyway, so conventional physics uses only the up and down motion of the slinky of the transverse wave, and that inertia, which is going up and down, is modulated to produce communications and energy and all the stuff we do with conventional physics of electromagnetic field theory. However, if that inertia of the transverse wave field effect enters a corrected vortex based on golden ratio called phase conjugation, translation of vorticity, precisely tuned to the Planck threshold, the Planck length and time, by my original equation entitled Origin of Biologic Negentropy, where you take that Planck length and time and multiply by integer exact exponents of golden ratio 1.618033989. You get all this cool stuff: 3 radii of hydrogen, Earth year, Venus year, galactic year, precessional year, and all the important stuff, the adenosine diphosphate, and the list goes on and on and on. So you get how to tune the heart, you get how to tune the brain waves, you get how to tune the Earth to produce this translation of vorticity, to produce longitudinal wave embedding, incorrectly sometimes called torsional and scalar, as we've said many times. So what happens is, when that inertia goes down that cone accurately, the inertia entered that spiral on the cone going up and down. But as it goes down the cone, if the cone is accurate, called phase conjugation to Planck, then the inertia, which was transverse, comes out the other end, squeezed through the toothpaste tube, accurately to that Planck threshold, which is the only 0 point of 0 point energy, the only still point of every conversation in spirituality and transcendence and philosophy. The only 0 point that ever existed is precisely Planck. That is the 0 point. There is no other 0 point. Sorry. There is no other 0 in physics. That's 0 for physics, is Planck length and time. So that threshold, by agreement for a million light years in all directions from here, all waves seem to have agreed for some particular reason on this Planck dimension. And what happens is, at that dimension, that agreement produced a galactic radio of longitudinal waves, sometimes called gravity waves, sometimes called the collective unconscious, sometimes called the Rapture. Oh, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So if you really understand what's coming out the other end of that toothpaste tube, you understand suddenly it's orderly with respect to the compressional component of that wave called longitudinal electromagnetics. And when you interfere that in an orderly way at a distance, you get the only real physics of action at a distance, meaning plasma containment and heat containment for all fusion physics reactions, meaning the way, as we said, Xuan heated that thermistor with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage repeatedly in the laboratory, etc., etc. And all this mysterious, quote-unquote, spiritual conversations about people who affected things at a distance. And the reason that Therapy works at a distance almost all the time, if you understand how to do it, it's simple physics, is these longitudinal waves interact, but they interact in a very disciplined way, requiring a grid dynamic. So this means that, first of all, this is what we call the rapture. It is what we call transcendence. It's what we call going to the next dimension. It's what we call getting 5D. It's orderly distribution in the longitudinal array grid. It's specifically and exactly what is meant by the dream spell and the song line and the dreaming tracks and Aboriginal. You see these Aboriginal shaman sitting on these song lines, which we now know are these longitudinal arrays, and their eyes are closed and they're manipulating waves at a distance down this grid, and they're making the rain. Hello, Australia. Let's learn the physics. So the ability to embed in this longitudinal array, for example, determines whether or not you can lucid dream, and therefore whether or not you will take memory when you die. And this is a simple, and I repeat, simple electrical engineering problem. We know the people who have died and come back, they said, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral. We know the geometries you see when you die, and now we know the physics of why you see that, because it's implosive compression. We know why Raymond Moody reported all the surgeons are clear that the death visions are electrically contagious, because successful death is a precise phase, conjugate implosive black hole. And when Danny Schreiber died, bless him, he came back and told his lucid dreaming partner, thank you, Fiona, that he heard, not only did he see that, but during successful death, I think he had a successful death, he heard the audio heterodynes produced. So it's like the deep rolling thunder, the ringing in your ear you hear, because your DNA is doing that implosion, because that's the only way to get into that longitudinal grid array, sometimes called the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, and DNA radio. It's all about embedding coherently in that longitudinal array. So this then brings us back to the other conversation about what does that longitudinal array look like, and just for a review, which is really almost unnecessary here, but just some of the pictures. So what does that longitudinal array look like? Okay, so here, let me see if we have some of these pictures. So this is dodecaecosa array, originally from the Star Mother, but then if you see, this is the dodecaecosa array of the original Earth grid, anti-gravity in the world grid, the famous, and remember all the TV specials showing that why did every sacred site, pyramid complex, etc., on the planet exist in this dodecaecosa array right here. Why? What's the physics? Because that's the only place that the longitudinal compressional array grid can propagate efficiently. That's why on that grid, where the speed of light divided evenly into the wave diameters of the Earth, from Bruce Cathy's Harmonic 33, where he measured on that grid, which what we now know is a longitudinal wave array, which we now know is the physics of gravity waves, that Bruce Cathy repeatedly measured there was a dramatic effect on nuclear half-life and radioactive critical mass. Is that a threat to national security to know that? Well, it also happens to be the only way to die well, so maybe it shouldn't be a threat to national security to know how to die well. Okay, this is how the radio works. Every sacred ancient burial ground was located on the grid. The ancients understood this perfectly well. So, now there's the next part of this conversation introduces the extraterrestrial context in this to remember, humans are childish, of course, in not recognizing their relationship to extraterrestrial politics, and this will come very soon to threaten their survival. They must recognize their relationship to extraterrestrial politics. And so we're going to gently try to introduce that component in this conversation here. And with that in mind, I'm going to introduce a bit of a dialogue we had recently. I'm not just shifting gears here, I'm widening the picture to see how understanding what we've just talked about helps us understand our position with respect to extraterrestrial politics, and therefore the actual long-term possibilities of the human race. So, our friend, Med, we shall call her Mediator, she's wonderful. We've been working with her for a long time. I'd like to show you her website here now. I'm very glad she has gone more public. Here it is. Mediator Medias. I repeat, mediatormedias.wordpress.com, Med's website. She is the original contact to the Tegatan Pleiadians, who only after did Gosha and others make very famous on their very famous YouTube channel, Cosmic Agency. But the actual original contact is Med, the mediator. And so I'm going to introduce just a fragment of a correspondence to try to suggest some context, but I'm suggesting we look at Med's website. So Med has been very sort of family related to the Tegatan Pleiadians. Remember now, the Tegatan Pleiadians is the family from whom Enki and Enlil arrived, and that's quite clear. Every ancient culture on the planet pretty much says Pleiadians, that's where they came from. So, and remember, the Tegatan Pleiadians, and Med will confirm that this is a very difficult, very extremely female-dominated culture. And this film will then be at the top of our discussion of what this means in the context of ET Politics, the famous article where we assemble all our ET information fractalfield.com/fusionintheblood. That's where we put all this information. And part of that context here is our long-term study of Anton Parks's work, who confirms that indeed the Pleiadians were extremely matriarchal. And we learned that it's critical to understand that if you want to know every religion on this planet starts with fear of women. That's how I began to study the extraterrestrial politics, because I was trying to figure out where the fear of women came from on this planet. Well, guess what? The Pleiadians, that's where the fear of women came from on this planet. And if I may say, from my experience of conversations with Ned and others, that the female-dominated Pleiadian culture, unfortunately, at a certain level of emotional maturity, but happened to have the biggest guns in the local. But that's not really what this conversation is about. But Med, fortunately, has been also much more very conversant with the Andromedans. And I, as you may know, I knew Alex Collier fairly well in my years in Denver, Boulder, and encountered through him what I call the Andromedan mystics, Morine and Visayas. In later years, recently, actually, I had some personal telepathic contact with Visayas, who we learned later, also with Med's help. Visayas was, in fact, one of the military leaders of the Andromedans, even though, in fact, while the Andromedan ships were huge and their major craft wedge-shaped on the other side of the moon, we understand, which is where many of the Pleiadian crafts originally were harbored, even the Tegatans. The Andromedans were extremely spiritually mature and functioned as mediators in battle, but really seldom were involved at a military level themselves. But the Andromedans are important to understand a big picture here, because they are kind of some of the senior galactic core cultures in my view. But the particular part of the conversation, and I'm sorry if I jumped ahead of it there, but there's a particular part of this conversation that relates directly to what we've just been discussing, and it's here. So this is from a note that I was just writing to my friend Ned, whom I'm grateful to, saying that we have been discussing for a long time, quote, letting Earth become 5D, this is their language, happens as the frequency generators in the moon fail. Of course, on the surface, that statement would have no meaning to conventional scientists unless we had some measurements. Now, I'm going to give examples of that. So remember, this story has been repeated many times from many sources, and obviously there must be some truth to it, including from Med, that frequency generators in the moon create a bit of quarantine here. Now, Med has given us a lot more detail on that, but there are many sources. And basically, we all know probably that the NASA seismic data pretty much proved the moon was hollow and metal. That's old news. And the moon is probably, if you believe most of the myths, most of what Star Wars called the Death Star. Well, what did they mean by that? Well, according to this part of galactic history, and we're in the process of learning more details, was that the early galactic cultures, when they realized that the interventionist and at that time largely parasitic Draco and their progeny, the Kingu. So the Draco, you think of the dragon, that's what the Fusion in the Blood article is about, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. The Draco were called Ages of Uras, U-R-A-S, which became our word Uru, as in Uru Asa Ln. That means ancient dragon or Draco blood. And the Draco bloodline was the powerful one in our galactic sector, and unfortunately did not have much respect for humans. We were snack food and slaves. And we will continue to be snack food and slaves until we start to understand some of this physics, and that's why we're here. So the Kingu, who then became the largely parasitic reptilian inhabitants of the central Earth, and there were millions of them until just recent months, and supposedly Tegotan Pleiadians were in fact instrumental in reducing the parasitic Kingu population in the inside of this planet from millions to tens of thousands only. And we're supposedly to thank the Tegotan Pleiadians for that. Although we now understand that the higher Draco, called the Alpha Draco, which are much larger, actually have come to recognize the importance of respecting the freedom of indigenous peoples like primitive humans, And so the Alpha Draco helped to remove some of those kingdom years. But now we understand that the Andromedans invited the feminine-dominated Tayghat and Pleiadians to leave, and mostly have, because although they had the big guns, if I may say, they did not have the emotional maturity. But so this is only a story of context, and you shouldn't believe any of this until you've checked out many things for yourself. But I give you one example we've spoken of many times, but I suggest you do check it out. When you hear Jason Rice on Gaia TV, now remember, I don't believe some of the other, but Jason Rice, he has been through the lie detectors and the polygraphs and all the good stuff, and the psychological tests. And Jason Rice is clear, went to South America, projected on the moon, and the Nazis, with their Vimana, Nazi Bell, had in fact propagated Earth's worst humans to Mars and Ceres elsewhere, because we didn't understand propulsion, because we didn't understand how to make a sphere, a hypersphere, and make it plasma projective, which is exactly what the Mercury vortex called Vimana and Nazi Bell is. And that's the advanced propulsion science, and that's what we talked about in that fractalfield.com/vacuum energy conference I presented at in Amsterdam recently. But the conversation here, I really want to finish this thread, was could we actually measure what it means to become 5D and therefore survive the rapture? So remember, when they said during the rapture guns will melt, what they meant was, the physics is that a low dielectric constant material like the metal from which you make guns, which during charge compression will experience heat. So we've talked about this before. The physics is exemplified by the implosive hydrogen torch called Brown's gas or Joe cell. That hydrogen gas, sometimes called water gas, that gas will beautifully burn and melt steel, but it won't burn or melt your hand. The reason is dielectric constant. The steel resists implosive compression and therefore generates heat. That's why guns will melt during the rapture, whereas your hand will not. So this is what they call rapture or transcendence as 5D, is being able to experience the plasma spin density and therefore charge distribution unpacked beautifully of this implosive compression called phase conjugation to Planck. And to understand what the ETs meant by preventing portals from opening on the Earth, and thus preventing, in effect, how the rapture is modulated, we were told, and this is Med's conversation, that there were, at the ancient times when they realized that these Draco and Kingu had holed themselves up on Earth in the solar system, they planted these nuclear-powered frequency generators in this hollow metal Death Star moon, which prevented the portals from working and therefore isolated the locals. Remember, if you're an advanced extraterrestrial, obviously traveling through the speed of light is only possible if you phase conjugate by golden ratio through Planck into longitudinal coherent propagation, which is the physics of how stargates and portals work, one of which is named Uru, Asa, LM. Uru, Draco, Asa, Queen, L, place of the transcendence or phase shift, and that's otherwise known as Jerusalem. So the ability of these implosive plasma projective stargates to work depended upon this harmonic series, this cascade. And you all know that Jerusalem is so beautifully sitting on this PowerPoint, this dodecaecosa longitudinal embedding plasma projective possible because of longitudinal coherence. The same reason in physics of why the famous Kozyrev mirrors only produce military quality transcendence or military quality telepathy if you put on these nodes, which is why every ancient cathedral and sacred burial site and stone circle and labyrinth were always placed on these longitudinal magnetic lines, which is why, the Therify plasma works beautifully at a distance in many of our centers, but it works better if both the sender and receiver are placed on these magnetic line cross-point nodes where there's this implosive dimpling, which plasma projects into coherence, embedding this longitudinal grid array, which is where the radio of the rapture works. For the same reason that action at a distance works better, and Therify works better, and Agnihotra works better at sunrise or sunset, and at equinox, or rather solstice, at solstice, because of the right angle physics of four-wave mixing, which enables phase conjugation. So remember, you're sitting there and they're lighting the plasma flame of the Agnihotra, and your hair stands up only at precisely the second of sunrise or sunset, the only time when the green flash is possible, because the longitudinal array becomes available to you only at that precise moment, just like the lasers had to be angstrom accurate right angle four-wave mixing in order to phase conjugate and produce measured negentropy and time reversal, which is the first time negentropy and time reversal was ever measured in physics. So these right angles are very important to this. Lining yourself up to embed in this longitudinal propagation, and therefore where you have access to this longitudinal array and access to the Rapture. And from this node or array, you can die successfully, lucid dream successfully, and any aboriginal worth his salt knows you got to find where the long song lines cross. So, what was the conversation? We understand, measure how implosive frequency signatures enable charge collapse. In other words, we now know what the frequency series is. There's 8 Hertz, and there's 30 Hertz, and there's 50 Hertz. These are the frequencies that made Antoine Priori work. These are the frequencies that make Therify work, and they learn from Lakhovsky and Tesla. And because these are precisely golden ratio multiples of Planck, which I discovered, and that's how we perfected Therify. So, embedding in longitudinal EMF, and therefore this business of being able to get into 5D, actually is measurable. So, you know, we've talked about this in many international lectures, fractalfield.com/conjugate mind, how this longitudinal array actually is the business of actually unpacking your mind. Because when you close your eyes and you see this wave picture crystallizing in the liquid crystal optical electromagnetic hologram that is your mind, the implosive center point is the conjugate point called conjugate mind, which is why your brainwaves do best at golden ratio, called flameinmind.com. The physics of bliss. And therefore, the light begins to crystallize. You remember, it's very, if you can make alpha, then when you close your eyes, you see the light. If you can't make alpha, then when you close your eyes, you see the dark. That's why beer drinkers drink beer, is to make the alpha so that they see the light. Turn the lights on. So the ability, and this is because that alpha is actually Schumann, and the Schumann is golden ratio to Planck, which is phase conjugate implosive. That's how Gaia is negentropic. So we wanted to finish this conversation, or try to finish this conversation, by giving you a measurement example. And so I'm speculating that these frequency generators in the moon, which, by the way, now Med says clearly they're breaking down the obsolete nuclear tech which was used to power these frequency generators in the moon, is breaking and can't be fixed. And more than half of them already died, and they're dying quickly. And that means that the Earth will then be subjected to much more of this implosive compression, formerly called the Rapture or the photon cloud, whatever you call it. It's actually simply a symmetric compression that you must either compress successfully or experience heat. In other words, go to heaven or hell. Quite literally. I mean, quite literally. So, and so Med and others have said, and I'm sure they're correct, that as this experience of compression, the Rapture, there will be more earthquakes and volcanoes, of course. And people who are relaxed and able to do this compression, which is the same skill it takes to lucid dream or die well, they will become clairvoyant. And they will hear their inner voices. They will hear their ancestors. You know why? You know why you hear the ancestors? They all come out of their graves during the Rapture? Well, that's pretty simple physics. All these plasma cocoons suddenly get longitudinally embedded in the array, and they can then propagate again. They're no longer trapped. Do you know why Therify plasma is so famous for releasing ghosts? For the same reason, implosive plasma compression. So Therify is a small bit of Rapture physics, a little localized Rapture physics. Now, if you place the Therify at the longitudinal cross points, and use even longer waves, then you get a little bigger piece of the Rapture. And Therify plasma is famous, and I do mean famous, among shamans, like Kate Forbes in South Africa, who talks extensively about it in the therify.net/blog. It's famous for accessing shamanic portals. So now we know what a portal is. And even Bill, very famously, well, described. You know, if you line up these phase conjugate arrays, the send and receive point accurately, that's exactly, and I mean the physics of how the ancients set up the portals to propagate from here through the heart of the sun and to the heart of Andromeda, which is where that Stargate goes. So we know the physics of how to set up the electromagnetic send and receive at these phase conjugate points, which is the actual physics, and I do mean physics of the movie Stargate. You know, that was the actual Ophanim-Enochian alphabet, back to Terry Burns, that was used to make the movie Stargate, because that's how these plasma portals work, by setting up this hypercube dodecaecosa plasma grid array to make this implosion and propagation into the longitudinal possible. And you go down these longitudinal wormholes in this dodeca called the movie Contact. Hello, Jodie Foster. So now you're getting a clue why, if you prevent these critical frequencies from propagating, you can shut the stargates and portals and prevent the Earth from imploding, which these ancient frequency generators, the frequency fence, the frequency quarantine, was supposedly doing per these many, many reports. Now you say, well, this sounds a little speculative to you. Fair enough. Okay, where's a measurement? Well, okay, we're going to do a measurement right now. So here is our breakthrough technology, flameinmind.com/lifeforce. We simply take our famous brainwave sensor, we measure a microvolt, and we spectrum analyze. We're using the Muse wireless transmitter, which we use for the brainwave analysis, but we use it also to measure life force in trees and life force in the grid here. Flameinmind.com. And the life force component there, if you click on /lifeforce, I wanted to show you some examples. So here we're measuring the harmonic content of bamboo sacred architecture. And you see this harmonic cascade here, beautiful, and the Schumann harmonics show up. So you can predict in advance which building will cause a seed to grow, hint bamboo, and therefore which architect deserves a paycheck. Whereas the steel and aluminum building will prevent these harmonics, will prevent seeds from growing and your children from having a soul. Therefore, that architect does not deserve a paycheck. And it's measurable. That's our global curriculum, which is becoming famous, goldenmean.info/architecture. Well, it goes beyond that. So here, what we're showing is, in the various sacred spaces, we've done this now repeatedly around the world, and we must credit Patrick Botte, B-O-T-T-E, my co-inventor for flameinmind.com, from Belgium, who's made a lot of these beautiful measurements and programmed all 6 or 7 of our new biofeedback apps, okay? And the new ones are plasmafire.com, Real Heart, plasmapHIRE.com, 5vibes.com, realheartcoherence.com, flameinmind.com. I mean, we're just going to town on these powerful, powerful biofeedback apps. You can teach love and empathy and tantra by measurement. It's really fun. And the psychokinesis of these implosion harmonics now in vibrators on your spine and in plasma balls of various types, quantify, plasma fire, therify, is beautiful. It's all the same harmonic recipe, my equation. Anyway, so we're measuring these sacred spaces around the world. We've been wandering around, and here it is. We have cows in a magic field, very fertile area, and the cows are in the field. These ladies are outstanding in their field. The cows are in the field. And what do we measure? Oh, here's this 53 Hertz harmonic peak. Here it is there, here it is there. Here is a biologic dome. This is a wooden sacred dome structure. And here's this powerful harmonic at 53 Hertz. And here is Patrick went to Sam Osmanagich Bosnian pyramid, very famous and great friend of ours, is wonderful. And he's measured the infrasound and related it directly to the rejuvenation effect that millions of people come there to get rejuvenation, the same way they come to Therify to get rejuvenation, because phase conjugate charge implosion is negentropic. So here we're measuring the Bosnian pyramids, thanks to Patrick Botte. And again, 53 Hertz. Why are we getting 53 Hertz on all these places? So we went back to our homework, scratched our heads, and here's this conversation here about that. It says, you know, Dan Winter's equation predicts that if you take Planck and exactly multiply by golden ratio, you should get 50 Hertz. And true enough, 50 Hertz was central to Prairie and central to Therify, and is the most mentioned frequency in all the medical literature on what heals cancer. Yes, 50 Hertz with the publications, therify.net/blog. So 50 hertz is pretty cool. And by the way, if you got that 50 hertz, you could make carbon nano grow to the 99% pure. That will change every industry on this planet. Thank you, Carl. And if you try to do it in 60 hertz, sorry, USA, your carbon nano ain't gonna grow. What's the problem? Tesla got that a little wrong. Oops. So 50 hertz is precisely, it was 49.99 something, the golden ratio to Planck, whereas 60 hertz does not implode, therefore does not get negentropic, therefore prevents your children and your seeds from growing. Hello. So then we asked this simple question. We said, well, how come we're measuring 53 hertz when we should be measuring 50? And so we went down the charts and we said, oh, well, the actual calculation, that's right here in blue, I don't know if you can see it in the small print. The calculated frequency of what the Schumann resonance should be from my equation, 7.29 hertz, 11.8, 19.09 hertz. However, the measured Schumann harmonics, well-published, well-known, well-established, very common, very standard, and by the way, Greg Braden, they're not changing. No, the cascade is increasing in harmonic inclusiveness, but they're not increasing in frequency. Wrong. It's the harmonic inclusiveness that's changing. So anyway, the actual Schumann frequency measured is 7.83 hertz, 14 and 20.8. So it's close to the of the theoretical, but not accurate. Now, if you take the 7.83 measured Schumann harmonic and keep multiplying that by golden ratio, you know what you get? 53 hertz. Hello! The difference between the real Schumann and the correct Schumann, 7.29 versus 7.83 hertz, is exactly the ratio between 50 and 53 hertz, which are exactly golden ratio exponents times. So, the Earth grid is almost implosive, almost transcendence, almost ready for the rapture, but the Earth grid could get tuned a little bit. Remember when Lovelock wrote the Gaia hypothesis and he proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Earth grid is self-organizing. Temperature, pressure, ability to maintain life. Obviously, Earth is self-organizing. Why? It's because it's negentropic. Well, why is Earth negentropic? Because of the Schumann harmonics. Why are they because phase conjugation of Planck. So why, when you make those same frequencies in your brain waves, do you get transcendence and the rapture and bliss? So this is all tunable, and so we actually have our ET condex now in the process of confirming, and we thank Embed and others, whether or not these frequency generators in the moon are actually involved in this 50 versus 53 mystery. So we are very close by measurement to proving how external oscillators control whether or not the Earth grid is negentropic implosive and whether the Stargates work, and whether we and our children have access to the rapture. Now, all of this conversation has a practical implication, which is that as you locate your meditation, your birth and your death and your prayer and your therapy and your plasma and your altar and your cathedral and your labyrinth, where to put them, or your cozy rev mirror, you need to be able to douse very simple field of magnetic lines, because that's the blood of the Earth, that's the longitudinal electromagnetic coherence grid, and that's the bloodstream of the collective unconscious. So if you embed and distribute your aura in that, you can wake up with a larger body called Hey Ave, where the breath of charge takes flight, heaven, or the planes of Sharon, etc., etc. Planes of Sharon, we know, is the physics of the hyperextended electrical orbitals of the phase conjugate materials of gold nano, etc., as Lawrence Gardner discussed from David Hudson. So all of this conversation leads us to a real physics of, instead of New Age woo-woo saying, well, are you 4D yet, or are you 5D? Have you done the transcendence? Are you transcendent? Have you had your rapture experience today? Have you gotten 5D? No, it means whether your aura has been accurately tuned to phase conjugate and implode, and that's tunable in brain waves and heart rate variability and in the Earth grid, and this frequency signature can be measured and taught with biofeedback. Now, the psychological component of that is, when you get this harmonic cascade accurate in your brainwaves, flameinmind.com, what is the first thing you do? You cry for a month, as I did, for every unshareable thought you ever had, because that is how you embed in that grid, is because it had charge of distribution. So there's, you know, you can't die well if you're angry, because these waves are not shareable. They cannot embed in charge distribution perfect. So the ability to sort your emotions and prepare for bliss or death is the same physics. And that's what this frequency signature of the charge implosion really means, because there's increased spin density down there and increased awareness down there, but there's only one mind there. Thank you very much.